Well, good morning and happy Sunday. Today we're going to continue our look. Started last time I preached, we opened up the book of Ecclesiastes and looked at the first two chapters. And we're going to continue probably as I preach for the rest of the year. We're going to be in the book of Ecclesiastes. So today we are in chapter 3. If you're following along, you can open up to that. I'll start reading it in a minute. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. Side note about that, if you're not familiar with how we get our translations, there's groups of people, scholars, who are very good at translating, and they will go back to the manuscripts that we have, and they'll take it right from the Greek and the Hebrew, and then they will bring that into modern day English. And some translations, such as like the NASB, are more word for word translations, whereas some other translations are more thought for thought. ESV is kind of in the middle there, I would say. It's an easier reading translation than the NASB, which stands for New American Standard Bible, and the ESV for English Standard Version. At any rate, I have a tendency to go with the ESV. Pastor Tim has a tendency to go with the 1995 NASB. They're both great translations for our English readers. So if you missed the last teaching that we did on the book of Ecclesiastes, I would encourage you, maybe not right now, but at some point in the next week, to go back and take in that lesson. The book of Ecclesiastes has a very interesting writing style that you have to be aware of in order to understand the book properly, where the author is giving someone else's point of view. Really, in Ecclesiastes, we have two people. We have the author and the preacher or the teacher. And the teacher gets up there and he presents a point of view, and he's teaching in a unique style, almost a philosophical kind of style, where you present an argument and then you come back at it and show how it falls short. And what he's doing, if you look through the first two chapters of Ecclesiastes without that in mind, you can think to yourself, my goodness, this is a depressing book and there's no hope and everything's worthless and there's no point of anything. But what you come to understand is he's presenting two worldviews. He's presenting the worldview of life without God and life with God. At any rate, we're not preaching chapter 1 and 2 today, so I won't go too much into that. But we're looking at chapter 3 today, and it has a lesson of great importance. Very, very, very important lesson. And if you can pick this lesson up and take it in and apply it to your life and remember it in your brain as you're going through difficult times in life or easy times in life, it will change your life. It really will. And so I'm going to start by reading the first 8 verses of chapter 3 from the book of Ecclesiastes. And it reads, "For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill, and a time to heal, a time to break down, and a time to build up, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek, and a time to loose, a time to keep, and a time to cast away, a time to tear, and a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak, a time to love, and a time to hate, a time for war, and a time for peace." So this is a very interesting list. And what you can start to pick up on if you sit down and you look at the list, maybe take a piece of paper and write them out, one extreme on one side and the other extreme on the other. So you'd have love and then hate, to tear and sow, seek and loose. And you'll see that these are the two extremes of a category. And what the writer is doing, or what the teacher is doing, is presenting a way of thinking of, we have this list, so we have birth and death. And what he's saying is that there's a time for those things, but much like the mark on a gravestone of, oh, I was born in 1992 and I'll live until whatever year, that line in between, represents the rest of your living, and as does this. And so we have this time for this extreme and this time for the other extreme, and we're including everything else in the middle. And so that's interesting. If you look at that list, I would say for most people, it actually will include every part of the regular human experience. If we look at the human life, everything that we experience, go through, and do can be put into one of those categories. And once again, we have the two extremes and all the middle ground in between. Everyone's entire life existence, or experience rather, would fall into that list. And something that can remind us of is that there are different chapters and seasons in life. There's a time for casting away stones and a time to gather stones together. And so, you can think about someone who comes to a new piece of land, and they're turning the land over to create a garden, and they take the stones and they cast the stones away. But then, the floods are coming, or the enemies are coming, and so they gather the stones together to build a rock. You have times of peace and you have times of conflict. There's different seasons of life. And we have to remind ourselves of that as we go through the different seasons. Canadians, we're used to this. We go through our 4 main seasons, right? But we come to winter, and seasonal something depression, sad, right? Where in winter, a lot of people will suffer from that lack of vitamin D. You're not outside as much. You're moseying around more and whatnot. And what we need to remind ourselves of, spring is coming. Spring is coming. And then in springtime, you get the buds of life starting to come out of the ground, and the birds are chirping, the days get warmer. You're like, oh yes, summer is coming. And then in summer, you anticipate fall. And as we go through these different chapters of life, sometimes we can get caught up in just focusing on the now, when we can also be reminded that there's another season that is coming down the road. We can also sometimes have the habit of only remembering one side of the scale, one side of the list, right? We only focus on the sunny, healthy, fun days, and we forget the others. Or we focus on the dark, sick, and difficult days and forget about the good times. But as we'll see, that is a mistake, that we should actually rather remember all of them. That every day and every season and everything that we go through has a purpose, has a reason for it, and that we should hold on to those. And many of you, as I say that, you might be thinking, well, what about the really dark days? As I think over the congregation, and I think over the people that I know, and I think over my own life as well, we have gone through some dark days. As a society, as individuals, we have spent some days in the rain, and it can be hard to see that there's a purpose for the storm, but there most certainly is. In Psalm 139, verses 13 to 16, it's a section of text that many people are familiar with, I would say. It's written by David. It says, "You formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." And we usually will focus on that first part, and we'll talk about the beauty and the intricacy of a human being, and that God takes a role in that. We're not just an accident. We're not just this biological creation, but God has created us. He created us with care, and He knits us together, that He sees it as a wonderful work. But that last section too, and once again, we can read that, and we can read it and say, that's right, my wedding day and the day that my child was born, and that vacation where we went to the beach and sat in the sun. God, you wrote those days. But that's not what it says. It says every one of them in your book, in your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. This was written, as I said, by David, and a declaration that God had written out the days that he would walk before David even existed. And if we look at the life of David, we have a great catalog of the life of David in the Old Testament. And so we can say that God wrote out the days where he was in the sun with his flock, and they were down by the stream, and life was going well, and the grass was green, and the flock was healthy. God wrote the day where the lion would come to steal a lamb. He wrote the day where he defeated Goliath and was paraded in victory. And he wrote the day where he was hiding in a cave as Saul hunted him like a dog, when he had to take refuge in the land of his enemy. He wrote the days when he reigned as a good king. And he wrote the days where he failed and gave into lust with another man's wife. And he wrote the days where he held his lifeless child in his arms. And he wrote the day where he walked into the presence of God for eternity. And so we can look at this and it's quite shocking to some degree. It's an emotional thing to realize all the good and the bad days, God, you wrote them all. Now, in theology, we have two extremes. And I usually butcher the pronunciation of this first one, but Arminianism, or free will, and then determinism, Calvinist. And throughout my journey with God and studying God, going through Bible college, and even before that, I would look at both of these theological systems or doctrines, and I would have some agreements with each side and some disagreements with each side. And I found myself somewhere in the middle between them. As I looked through the scriptures, I found myself somewhere between them in the middle. And it wasn't until a number of years ago that in study that I found that there's actually a name for this, and this is Molinism. So I want to talk about that for a minute to help explain this, because I don't want to say that God wrote out and that it was the will of God that David slept with another man's wife and then had that man killed. Because God himself sends a prophet to confront David for his sin. Now, sin is operating opposed to the will of God. And so if God wills us to do the sin, then how is that against the will of God? That's where Calvinism, I believe, falls apart. But Molinism is the idea that God knows everything that Chris would do, even with my free choice, in any possible logical situation. And that means, like, if you think of your child, if you have a child and you take them to the ice cream store, you can probably guess what flavors ice cream they would pick and which ones they wouldn't. Now, sometimes they might surprise you with that. We have limited knowledge, but God has ultimate knowledge, and he knows us better than we know ourselves. And so he looks at it and he says, well, if I take Chris and I put him in this place, in this time, and he's interacting with these people, this is how he's going to respond. This is how he's going to act. But if I take him and I put him here in a different time period, or move him around, or put him in a different nationality or something like that, then I know how he's going to respond to that. So he can write the days, and he can almost orchestrate, even though we have the choice, to follow or to not. He knows what we will do. And that brings us to another idea, which I hold to, which is called the best of all possible worlds. The best of all possible worlds is this idea that goes like this. If God knows all the intricacies of placing all the different people in time and all the other situations in time, he would create the world which would have the most amount of good. He would create the world in which the most amount of people would freely choose to follow him and to worship him and to pursue his will and glorify his name. It's in his character that he would do that. And so, well, I can look around and I can look at my own life and I can say, I see evil here and I see dark days here and problems here. God looks at the world and he says, with man being able to choose to do right and wrong, this is as good as it possibly could be. And he's put people in just the right places for the most amount of people to freely choose to follow him. It's an interesting idea. It's an idea that I do hold to, and I think it fits into the Bible, and I think it fits into the character of God quite well. And so from that, I can say that the days that you have lived were written out before you ever existed. And you might not like that. There might be some days that you look at in your life and you're like, I wish I could rewrite that. I wish I could change that. I don't like how that went out. Oftentimes you'll sit through a movie or you'll read a book or a show or something of the sort, and you'll be like, oh, I wish they went this way with that, or the character development, what if we made this change, kind of thing. And we like to play director, even though many of us have never directed anything. But God is the ultimate director. And he made the perfect, well, as perfect as it could be, situation. And so he has a reason for doing why he does what he does. And he has a reason for each and every day that you have gone through. So first, let me say about the idea of I wish I could write my days different. I wish I could change the problems that I've gone through. Is that you are man or human. You are human, and God is God. He knows what he is doing. Trust him. He is good, and he does what he does for a reason. And he allows you to go what you go through, both the sunny days and the rainy ones, for a reason. And some of you have gone through some hard times. And I know about some of those hard times. And in some of those situations, I can actually look and see, okay, but I can see how your faith has grown because of this. Or because of this hardship that you've gone through, you've now developed this area of character that you didn't have before. Or ultimately, I can see how the problems that you've faced have brought you closer to God. And so that's good. The problem of pain, it is a problem, but it also builds strength, builds resilience, builds character. No one appreciates rest more than a worker. No one has gotten strong without lifting heavy things. People don't appreciate their health until they've been sick. And the truth is, I can't explain everything. I can't look at every detail of history, of humanity, and of your life, and even my life, and say, this is why God is doing that. And even when I find myself in the storm, sometimes I'll look and I'll be like, why is this happening? And it's in retrospect, looking back on the event, that I can say, now I see what you were doing. But that's not always the case. There's a lot of the times where we'll look at something that has happened and be like, I don't understand, God, why you allowed this to happen. But what we have to do is remind ourselves, you are God. Your ways are higher than my ways. Your knowledge is higher than my knowledge. And I trust that you are good and you know what you are doing. We can't explain everything. And that's part of having faith and trust in God, allowing God to be our king, to reign and to lead. What's the point of trusting a leader if you're going to question every single thing that leader brings you through? I can also tell you this, though, and this is a beautiful thing, is just a couple verses before David wrote out that part of the psalm, he wrote this: where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night as bright as the day, for the darkness is as light with you. It's a beautiful section of Scripture. And think of all the things that David has gone through. And he writes this out and says, I cannot escape you, God. Not necessarily that he's trying to, but it's this understanding of, if I find myself in heaven, if I find myself in Sheol, on the verge of death, if I take wings and go to the uttermost part of the sea, away from everything else, even there, God, you hold me and you guide me and you're with me. You can go through some dark times, and I know many of you have, but know this, you don't go through them alone. God is with you. He holds on to you. and he leads you, and he's with you, and we have to remind ourselves of that. There's a poem that I have read in my teaching and preaching over the years, in the 7 years that I've been at this church. And I come back to it every now and then, and you might be new to the audience. And so I'm going to read this again because I really enjoy this poem, and I find it quite good. It's a poem by Minnie Louise Haskins. It goes like this. And I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown. And he replied, go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than a light and safer than a known way. So I went forth, and finding the hand of God, trod gladly into the night, and he led me toward the hills and the breaking of day in the lone east. I like that. It's a poem that reminds us that a lot of times we want this map and we want to be able to see where we're going, like an interstate or a GPS that says, here's where you're going and here's where you're going to turn next and here's your arrival time. That's not how God works. Hold my hand. Let me guide you. Let me lead you. I'll tell you what to do and where to go. And sometimes we're going to be walking through grassy meadows, like a shepherd leading his sheep. Sometimes we're going to be going through grassy meadows. Other times we'll be going down well-worn paths. And sometimes we'll be on the edge of cliffs going around mountain passes. But the shepherd is with you. He'll hold you up. He'll take care of you. And when you need him to, he will hoist you up on his shoulders and bring you through. It's not to say we won't have rainy days. It's not to say our feet won't hurt. It's not to say we won't go through problems, because we will. But we don't go through them alone. We have God with us. The text continues, our main text of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business of God that he has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into the heart of man. Put eternity into man's heart. Yet so he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive that there is nothing better for him than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in his toil. This is God's gift to man. There's a wonderful truth in that text, isn't there? I mean, it is the Word of God. He makes everything beautiful in its time. The NASB will use the word appropriate, I believe. But it's this idea that in its time, God will make everything beautiful. And we can see that in our own life, where you look at some things in retrospect and you're saying, that's ugly. I don't understand that. That was hard. That was difficult. Why am I going through this? And then down the line, you look back on that and you can say, I see it now. I see what you were doing. But here's the thing. As I said, there's a lot of things in our life, in human history, that we can look at and we can say, I don't see the beauty in this. Well, give it time. You might never see the beauty in it. But God will make it beautiful. God will make it appropriate in its time. He takes what others meant for evil and uses it for good. He is able to do that, and it's wonderful. We don't always see the full picture. In fact, that's quite clear. On a grand level, we never will see the full picture, but we trust and know that God is doing something true and beautiful and wonderful. It's like if you go to an art gallery. I've been meaning to take my daughter to the art gallery we have here in the city, and you go to a large painting, like a really, really big painting, and you stand an inch away from it. You're just going to see splotches of color, and you're not even going to understand. Even some of these really grand paintings, if you take a step or two back, you're only going to see a small piece of it. And you might understand it, you might not, but it's not until you're able to get all the way back and see the full picture that you can take it in and understand it. The truth is that our amount of time that we have here on this earth, looking at all that God has done and being able to take it in, we can't take it in. We can't understand all of it. And so we're that person looking at just the couple inches of picture that we have in front of us. And we can just say with confidence and have that trust, God, I know you are doing something beautiful. I can't take it all in. I can't see it all, but I know that you are good. And your word says that will make all things new, that you will wipe away every tear, that you will make everything well. And I look forward to that. It says that God has put eternity into our heart. A sense, yes, that we will continue past the 100 years or so that we might live. But there's a desire to know more. We have this desire of, I want to know the eternity. I want to know the big picture. I want to know what you are doing. But we're unable to, right? Yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. We're unable to get the full picture. We cannot see what God is doing from beginning to end. But as I've said, we can trust and know that God knows what he is doing. You may not understand the why of why he brings you into the situations and things and pain and struggles and loss that you go through, or even the good times. But trust that he knows what he's doing. And so the advice giving is that you can't understand the full picture, the full work of what God is doing. So be joyful and do good as long as you live. Enjoy what you have and enjoy your work, that this is God's gift to man. To be able to sit back and say, I serve a good master and a good king, and I know that God is good and that he is doing something wonderful. And so I'm going to enjoy the small part that I'm currently playing in. I'm going to enjoy the things that God has done. I'm going to be joyful. I'm going to take delight in God regardless of situation. And I'm going to do good as long as I am. The author then gives us another reaffirmation of the unmovableness of the will of God. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor can it be taken from it. God has done it, and so that the people fear before him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. And God seeks out what has been driven away. This is a really neat piece of scripture talking about God in time. It's a passionate subject of mine, but we talk about God in time. God, of course, existing outside of time. He existed before time. God is eternal. But he also operates in time. And I kind of paint it this way. If we have the beginning, or I guess I should go on this side for camera's sake. We have the beginning. I can't really snap with that finger. The beginning, and then eternity going forward. But in human sense, we have a sense of an end. And God operates in that time. And it's not that he's bound by it. He can step out of it and see the full picture all at once. But he sees the day that you were born. He sees you riding your bike, and he sees your first bit of pain, and he sees this and that, and he sees the full thing, and he comes in and he moves this and he tweaks that and he moves everything around, but he sees the full picture at once. We look to the future and we say there's a day where God is going to come again. And in a sense, God looks at it and he says, I'm already there. And I'm already touching that just as I am this. He's outside of time, yet he interacts with it. Think about what that says there in that little ending piece of text. That which has already been, so we're talking past tense. That what has already been, that which is, so past, has already been. That's past tense. That makes sense to us. That which is to be, the future, the things that are going to happen, already has been. Well, wait a minute. How can that be if it's the future? Because God is outside of time. He's already put things in place. He already knows what's going to happen. That's why when God sends a prophecy through someone to saying, this is going to happen in the future, it's not a maybe. It's not a 90 or a 95 or a 98 or a 99.9% chance that this is going to happen. It's going to happen. And the truth of it is, outside of humans' experience, from God's eyes, from him looking at it, it already has happened. It is happening. He is doing it. He's omnipresent and across time as well. It already has been done. And so in the light and in the dark, remember this. God knows what he is doing. He is in control. And while you may only see a piece of the puzzle, know this. God is making something beautiful, and we should take joy in the small part that we get to play. So whether you're being born or you're dying, whether it is time to plant or a time to harvest, a time to kill or a time to heal, a time to break down or a time to build up, a time to weep or a time to laugh, a time to mourn or a time to dance, a time to cast away stones or a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace or a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek or a time to loose, a time to keep or a time to cast away, a time to tear or a time to sow, a time to keep silent or a time to speak, a time to love or a time to hate, a time for war or a time for peace, or all the in-betweens. Know this: God knows what he is doing. God is faithful. And we don't get to see the full picture, but we know that he's doing something good and that we can trust in him. One of the physical things that I'm going to do here on this Sunday in the sanctuary, or actually, well, after the sanctuary, but I'm going to tell them about it in the sanctuary, is give everyone a piece of a puzzle. And so if you happen to come in here next Sunday, I'll probably have some left over in my office you can get from me. Or if you just have a puzzle at home, you can take one piece of that puzzle, put it in your pocket, put it in your wallet, put it on the dash of your car, your desk your desk in your office, or somewhere where you're going to see it and be reminded, I might only see a little piece of the puzzle, but I know that God is in control, that God has placed my piece just where it needs to be, and that it's fitting together, even though it might not make sense to me. It's fitting together with the full picture of what he's doing. And what a wonderful thing and honor and gift it is to be used by God for his purposes, for his will. And in that we can take even delight in our suffering and know that God is doing this for a reason. He is good and he is faithful. That is our first look at Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There's a little bit more in chapter 3. We'll cover that next time. I hope that's an encouragement to you today. I hope you ponder on the word this week, and I truly do hope that you honor God in all that you do.